Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jane Alison's Self-Portrait in Egg, which is a lengthy poem. I'm reading an excerpt of it out of Women Recreating Classics, edited by Emily Hauser and Helene Taylor. So this is a really cool poem structurally because it's what we might call a braided poem, in which related but different thematic elements intertwine. So we sort of cycle through these different central experiences. So what we start with is, at least in this excerpt, is that day a small boy came up the drive, his parents behind looking cautious, no, worried, as he toddled toward my house. Right, so the first thing that we start with is this child that the poet persona sees in her driveway. And this prompts these reflections on her inability to have children and the struggles that she and her husband have gone through to try and overcome this challenge, etc., etc. All of this is linked to classical mythology, initially to Medea, but then later to this whole set of birth stories that are central to Greco-Roman mythology. Alongside that, we have the poet persona and her husband adopting some baby chicks, right? And starting to raise them, and then they lay eggs, etc., etc. And so the intertwining of those two, the intersection of those two, is the fertility of the chickens and the infertility of the poet persona, and how these things reflect onto one another within the poem. But then we have, so I'm going to call that the second major thematic, so the boy and the poet persona's infertility is the first, the chickens is the second, although chronologically it comes third. All right, I'm going to revise my ordering of it, but it's an arbitrary ordering, so don't worry too much about it, right? So the first thematic is the boy and this desire for a child that goes unfulfilled. The second, chronologically within this excerpt of the poem, is classical allusions or comparisons. The third is going to be the chickens, and then the fourth is going to be the poet persona's students, and the ways in which the relationships between the poet persona and students, or some students at least, develop into kind of familial dynamics, right? So this is the sort of structural complexity of the poem, because all of these things, we cycle through them, and the poem doesn't say this as such, but there's sort of an element, it's a kind of stream of consciousness almost approach in the way that these ideas interconnect with one another and loop, right? Because when we transition from one theme to another or back to another or whatever it is, you can almost hear that reminds me of this element. That reminds me of this other thing, right? You can almost, like structurally, that's kind of how it works, is you get this sort of, I'm talking about this, and that pushes my mind into this area, and that reminds me of this other theme, and this sort of continual pendulum motion of jumping from idea to idea, or swinging from idea to idea, if we're keeping the pendulum analogy, right? And all of this sort of revolves around these questions of maternity, fertility, family, generative ability, etc., right? So we start, again, with this small boy in the driveway, and then in the second stanza, we shift again to that myth, right? I thought of Medea, often do, not the Medea most people know, the one who killed her children, but a more ancient Medea who couldn't have babies, so went looking for others instead, wanting to have them, maybe just one, mostly just wanting, until people got unnerved by her wanting, and so her story changed. So this is an interesting one to start with. The mythic identification with Medea. Medea is one of the more complex figures of Greco-Roman mythology, I would say, in part because there are substantially different versions of her story. The best known today is the one that comes from the Euripides play. Combine that, I would say the second best known portrait of her is probably from the Argonautica, or Jason and the Argonauts, as we tend to call it today. She is associated with magic, with violence. She's associated with murdering her children, with being a spurned wife, all of these things, right? So the associations are primarily negative, with the big caveat that feminists often reclaim Medea. And feminist reworkings of the Medea myth often are much more sympathetic to her, which I think is quite fair. But Medea is this complex figure who has these strong negative associations for the most part in the popular mind, and seemed to have largely negative associations in much of Greco-Roman culture. But what Alison does in this poem is evoke a different Medea tradition. And so this immediately sort of raises this challenge to simplistic narratives, maybe, but to the narrative that we think we know, right? And this is, I think this is an addressing of tropes, right? In a way, because I think there is a trope of the childless woman who is desperate for a baby, right? I think this is something that we can recognize within our culture. It's something that becomes a premise of storylines, etc., etc. And yet what this approach to Medea suggests is we can invert that, or we can look at that figure from a different angle and see something different. And I think in this poem, Self-Portrait in Egg, Alison is trying to sort of explore that, right? That, what does that desire mean? What does the unfulfillment of that desire mean? And what does that tell us about the person who experiences that desire and that unfulfillment, if anything, right? And I think this is the sort of interesting element. And one of the things that we sort of get in this poem is a sort of continual, or what the poet persona gets in the poem is a continual reminder of motherhood and the potential of motherhood, right? So with the chickens, when they start to come of age, to start having eggs, what she says here is, I hadn't known how it worked, with hen, rooster, and egg, what went where and how and when, but learned from a man like Foghorn Leghorn, who boomed when I asked, a chicken's just like you, makes an egg every day, doesn't need a rooster. A chicken just like me. I brooded over this. Eggs I'd spilled over every 22 days, bloody clutch sliding down the toilet. But when I wanted these invisible eggs, they grew shy, they hid, and the ones that appeared were shelled and hard, would not crack open, no omelette. right? So the chickens remind the poet persona of her challenges conceiving a baby. And then we shift from there. We have a short sort of transitory paragraph, and then we shift to this list of mythic associations with birth, with motherhood, with generation. So the short transition stanza is, but our chicks that each day would produce that each would produce a perfect egg each day, alone a wonder, miraculous virgins bearing eggs that aren't only eggs but sculpture. So the miraculous virgin is, of course, a mythic reference. In the West today, Mary is the most famous Virgin Mother, but there are others from mythology. But then we go to this. I think of other miraculous virgins, extraordinary conceptions and births. Here are some. Dana and the splash in her window, Athena and the squirt on her leg wiped quick with wool, then put in a box to ripen to boy, Semele and the shock of lightning that smoked her whole, then the baby stitched in a thigh, or the swan feathery soft between Leda's legs, boy girl god Phanes hatching from a silver egg and made of light with wings, Helen hatching from Leda's egg, or one of them anyway. Leda had two. One on ancient vases, it's like an ostrich egg, fills two careful hands, though some say Helen wasn't laid by Leda, but by Nemesis disguised as a goose who left her eggs in a grove, and a shepherd found one and gave it to Leda, who put it in a closet to hatch. I picture Helen in there, all her beauty, tiny little Helencula, peeping through the shell to Leda, Pipio, Pipio, Pipio. So again, we've got, like, when you start sort of putting it serially like this, right, it becomes really striking how much of ancient mythology is fascinated by births, the births of deities in particular. And you think about something like one of the earliest important Greek theological documents was Hesiod's Theogony, which is literally the genealogy of the gods, right? It is focused on the births and the relationships, the upbringing, the family structure of the gods. But again, we've got all of these different examples, right? Athena, who is born from Zeus's forehead, fully formed. Dionysus is born when Zeus strikes Semele with lightning, and then he takes the baby and sews it into his thigh. All of these different ones, right? She's got this laundry list of classical myth. And so for an author like Alison, and then presumably like the poet persona, who has done a lot of her work around adaptations of and reworkings of Greco-Roman mythology, that the world of intellectual labor is run through with reminders of fertility and generative ability, in contrast to the poet persona's direct experience of struggling to conceive a child. However, we also have this, again, competing thematic of the poet persona's students. And we have this character, N. So all of the characters other than the poet persona, who gets a full name, Jane, all of them are just referred to by an initial. So this student N seems to be an Australian student who has come to the US. And Jane Alison is an Australian poet who lives and works in the US. So there's an autobiographical element to that. Whether N is based on a real person or not, I have no idea, but it's kind of irrelevant for the purposes of the poem, right? So N is this Australian student who has come to the U.S. to work with Jane in the poem, the poet persona. And at the end of this excerpt, what we get is the poet persona has been startled by a noise outside and has run out to the hen house to make sure that the chickens are not being attacked by a fox or something, right? She finds that they're fine, so she goes back in. And then it says here, just as I turned off the lamp, my phone tinged, picked it up, put on glasses. It was N sending a note. Dear Jane, I've decided you're my American mother, so happy Mother's Day from me and the chicks. And so this introduces or reintroduces really this thematic of what family is, right? Family, and this is a very common thematic in contemporary literature, particularly feminist literature and especially queer literature, that family does not have to be blood. Family does not have to be people that you are related to by blood. Family is instead those who support you, those who are there for you, those who care for you, etc., etc., and that those bonds are the bonds that are important. And I think it's a very positive note to end on, bearing in mind that we do not get, in this excerpt at least, and I don't know if this is the proper end of the poem or what, but at least in this excerpt, we do not get the poet persona's reaction to this message. That is still a question mark here. But again, the fact that it ends here, at least in this excerpt, I think suggests a very positive view of this conceptualization of family.